I hope you'll join me today as we study the 10th period of Bible history, known as the period of Judah alone. Thank you for joining me today as we discuss this 10th period of Bible history that we call the time of Judah alone. In our last lesson, you remember that we discussed a time to where God's people had divided themselves into two nations, the northern kingdom of Israel, that was made up of the 10 northern tribes, and also the southern kingdom of Judah was made up of the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. We learned about how that nation, the kingdom of Israel, had no good king in its entire history after they divided, and because of that, God told and warned through the prophets that he would destroy them. Remember that covenant that God makes with his people. God doesn't ever break his covenant, but people are going to break covenants, and they did. They didn't serve him. They worshiped idols. They served false gods, and God, because of that, because they're not faithful to him, he's going to punish them as he told them he would. I remember this goes back to the time of the conquest, where they did not dispossess the land, so they moved into this land with some of the people still living there who were pagan religious people and who taught them bad worship practices. They brought a lot of that with them from Egypt, and so they just never could let the idolatry behind them. And because of that, out on these about 200 years that Israel existed in this divided kingdom period, they didn't have a good king and they didn't follow God. And he eventually, as we learned in our last lesson, he destroyed them through that empire of Assyria. And that was about 722 BC when that happened. So after that, we have this kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, who is still there. And so that's why this period is called the time of Judah alone. Israel has been taken into captivity. They are mixed with other nations, and some they take them captive and then bring in other people to live in the land. So it's a terrible situation, and that's important to remember in a couple of more lessons as we talk about some things. But here is Judah. Now, the difference in Judah and the reason that God is long-suffering and patient with them is that they have had a few good kings. In the book from Brother Kaiser, he did put asterisks beside good kings. So that's a good place to start. Link to a chart, and I'm going to link to that chart again this time. Because the chart I linked to has all of the kings even after this or during this period of Judah alone, but it doesn't mark good kings and bad kings. And so here's a time where Judah still exists and they have some good kings. In fact, the first one during this time is Hezekiah, and he was a good king. And then really just, you have a chart that I encourage you to look at. But then there's Manasseh, who was a bad king. Then there's Ammon, who is a bad king. And then Josiah, who was a young king, 8 years old, but he was a faithful, good king. And that's the last one they had. So during this time, there's basically two good kings, Hezekiah and Josiah. After that, Eliakim and Jehoiakim, and then Jehoiakim, which is confusing. And then finally, a king whose name had been changed to Zedekiah was their last king. In the last 20 years of Judah alone, they were already being besieged by Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon. And so they eventually, because they will not stay faithful, they are destroyed just like Israel was. You know, it's easy to think. You think they would learn, but how many times do we not learn when we see God's work and God's punishments? But this is the case as it was with Judah. They saw what had happened to their brothers, so to speak, in Israel, but these kings just didn't care about God for the most part. And so in 3 stages, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon will take over and take these people of Judah captive. We'll talk about that in our next lesson in that period of history. That will be the period of captivity. But I want to talk just for a minute about how the kings and the prophets work together, what made a king a good king. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. Before we go on any further, let's just talk about this time period in our Bibles. And I encourage you to listen to the last week's lesson where we talked about how the books of the Kings and books of Chronicles and the purpose of them and how they worked. That is so helpful. I don't want to talk about that again. So go back and listen to that lesson if you don't remember or if you're new to this lesson. But in our Bibles, you can read about this period of Judah alone in 2 Kings, beginning with chapter 18 all the way through chapter 25, verse 30. And also you can read about this in 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. And also remember, the prophets at the end of the Old Testament, they coincide with these time periods. And so for this time period, Jeremiah and that book of Lamentations, and Obadiah and Nahum, Habakkuk and Zephaniah, all of those prophets and books of prophecy are coinciding with this time period. So it's good to study those along with this period. And so that's where I love a book like this. It can kind of lay that out for you and make it simplified a little bit. Sometimes that's hard to keep up with. But I wanted to talk about good kings, what made them good. And I thought it would be interesting and maybe eye-opening to see what these kings were dealing with and how they interacted with the prophets and how they listened to God. So really quickly, I want to just zoom in a little bit on the king Hezekiah. He was one of those good kings. And I want to just highlight him because you can see that these good kings weren't perfect. In fact, they made some mistakes, but what made them good, you'll see as we highlight this. I would like, if you want to turn to 2 Kings chapter 18. We're going to be in starting verse 13. And what I'm going to do is try my best to go through and highlight some verses that will give you an idea of what's going on with Hezekiah at this time. Remember, this is right after Israel had been overtaken by this Assyrian army, the king called Sennacherib. And we read right after that here is Hezekiah, the king of Judah. And Assyria basically says, you're next. You're coming next. So if you start reading in chapter 13, you can see that. And Hezekiah, it seems, was scared. He was scared. And he wanted Sennacherib to let him, to not punish him, to not overtake his kingdom. And so he promised to give him some money. He stripped the gold off the temple doors, and he took some of the gold out of his own house, and he's giving this as tribute to this king. Now, there's something wrong with that. He should have been trusting God. So that's why I say these kings are not perfect when we call them good. And so Sennacherib comes on down and basically says, that's not enough. It's not enough. And he even accuses Hezekiah or calls him out on trusting the king of Egypt at the time. And so maybe there's a little bit of you're thinking Egypt can save you. And maybe that's why Hezekiah's having to kind of beg for mercy because he had made an agreement with the king of Egypt. But then here are some sad things. He sends a man named, or at least his title. Let me see if I can say this right. I can't find it. Rabshakeh. All right. So I think it's a title. And he sends this guy to talk to Hezekiah's army. And he wants the people around the walls to hear. They beg him to speak in Aramaic because the people can't understand that, but they can. But he says, no, I want the people here. So he engages in a little bit of psychological warfare where he says, I don't know what Hezekiah's telling you, but you're not going to be saved. You're not going to be saved. He says, don't listen to Hezekiah in verse 31 of chapter 18. He says, make your peace with me. The king of Assyria says, you can come with me and I'll take care of you and you won't die. And so he's trying to make it look really good. And then he says an appalling statement. Has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his hand out of the hand of the king of Assyria? That's verse 33. So he is really mocking, he is making God on the same level as these gods of these pagan countries, these pagan nations that King Sennacherib has overtaken. And so when the military leaders come and report to Hezekiah, they come with their clothes torn. Hezekiah, this is what makes him a good king. He sends word to the prophet Isaiah, who is prophesying during this time, and he asks, go see if Isaiah will ask God that since this king mocked him, if he won't destroy him. He wants Isaiah to talk to God for him, and that's how these kings and prophets work together. Now, after he asked Isaiah to talk to God for him, Isaiah reports back to Hezekiah. Down in chapter 19 is where we're reading this of 2 Kings. And he says the Lord said that because he mocked him, Sennacherib sent that messenger, the Rabshakeh, to mock God, that he's going to destroy him. That alone, it shows that Hezekiah is trusting God. And in this world at this time where, it was customary to pay tribute to a king, to beg for mercy from the king of Egypt, so to speak, here is Hezekiah with a change of heart saying, I know that God is the only way out of this mess that I'm in. And that made him a good king, to trust God, to know that within his power, he is not able to fix this problem, but he knew God was. And so there's a few other things that happen down in 2 Kings chapter 19, starting with verse 14. You can read Hezekiah's prayer is so beautiful. In verse 15, he says, you are the God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth, you have made heaven and earth. He's acknowledging God is the one true God. And then he says, truly, the kings of Assyria have laid waste to the nations. I mean, he had been watching this all over the place. And their lands of men's, let me start that over. The kings of Assyria have laid waste the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were not gods. These nations, gods, weren't really gods. And he's saying, I know you are really God. He said, but they're just the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore, they were destroyed. He knows that even though that Rabshakeh, that's a hard word to say, that even though he's saying, we're going to destroy this God just like we destroyed the other nations' gods, Hezekiah knows our God is different. He's the one true, living, almighty, powerful God. And he is praying to God, letting him know that I believe this. So the end of the story is that because of Hezekiah's faithfulness, Judah is saved from Assyria. They end up, as I said earlier, after Hezekiah died, there were bad kings with one other good king in Josiah. But after that, these kings did not show this kind of faith. And that is why God allowed people from a pagan country like Babylon and the king Nebuchadnezzar, who was not a believer, come in and destroy this nation of his people. And so it has to do, and I just wanted to highlight that to see that's what set Isaiah apart. And also the thing is interesting, that's how a good king interacted with the prophets of God. They were supposed to ask the prophet and do what the prophet said because the prophet was talking to God. And so that's important for us to know, to always consider God when we're making decisions. Consider his opinion and his guidance over our own, and we will fare much better than we would if we just, go through life doing what we want to do. This is a sad time after they are destroyed. This time where Judah eventually is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylon Empire. We're going to talk next week in that 11th period of Bible history about this period of captivity that Judah is going to go through, and we'll have a lot more details. Please check out our worksheet, and especially the King's chart is so helpful, and just Hopefully you love the links, that they're being helpful. Sometimes it's very interesting, a lot of extra reading, but I think they're helpful. So thank you, and join me again in our next lesson.